The streets are like the arteries of a city. They're how people get from one place to another, from home to work, or school, or just a night out on the town. These streets give us a clear path to make it to our destination and then back home. Whether you're driving or just taking a stroll down the sidewalk, your local streets are usually a familiar place that you use every day without a second thought. But sometimes, the streets end up being dead ends. Jessica Williams had been born to an alcoholic drug addict and was placed into a foster home when she was only 9 months old. Her foster parents, Sam and Becky Williams, took her in as their 8th foster child. Due to her mother's lifestyle while pregnant, Jessica had fetal alcohol syndrome, which brought with it developmental disabilities. Jessica wasn't purposefully a troublemaker, but her disability made it hard for her to follow instructions. Soon the Williams moved for work to the Portland, Oregon area. They settled into a large house in a Portland suburb. Here, the Williams did what they could to help Jessica get through school, but the system wasn't set up to handle children with fetal alcohol syndrome. She was treated like she was just a lazy troublemaker. Even though it took a few extra years, Jessica managed to graduate from high school. Now she was ready to move on to a job, but there wasn't much of a job market for positions that she could handle. She had a temp job at a pet store, which she excelled at, but they weren't able to keep her on long term. In 2002, Jessica was struggling to deal with the fact that she was 22 years old with no job, so Becky talked to the county disability services and they found her a part-time job at a retail outlet in downtown Portland. This job gave Jessica the opportunity to explore the city. Since she had always lived in the suburbs, she found the city to be an exciting place filled with adventure. Just 2 blocks from her work was Pioneer Courthouse Square. During the holidays, the square had a large tree displayed with lights and ornaments. Jessica liked to go down there, get lunch from a food truck, and look at the displays. This area was also home to a number of street kids who would panhandle. Jessica, being an outgoing and friendly person, sat down by one of the kids and struck up a conversation. This became her daily lunch routine. It didn't take long for that kid to suggest Jessica help him steal some clothes. He told her he could get some clothes and go to her register where she would only pretend to ring him up. Jessica was not about to break the law, let alone for someone she barely knew. She got upset and told Becky about the incident. Becky told Jessica to stay away from the boy, but it wasn't long before she had forgiven him and was again spending her lunch break on the sidewalk. The retail job was only temporary for the holidays, so by January, Jessica was once again unemployed. Jessica was a determined person, so she continued taking the bus downtown to look for another job, and soon she was meeting more and more street kids. One day, she told them that her parents had kicked her out of the house. Sam and Becky would never kick one of their children out of the house. They were able to successfully foster a lot of children for a reason. They were patient and understanding. Jessica wanted to fit in though, and she thought that this was the way to do it. She attempted to emulate what she saw the street kids do, but she didn't understand the rules they lived by. She eventually began to rub the group the wrong way. It didn't help that she pretended to be one of them and then went home to a warm bed and a hot meal at the end of every day. Then Jessica began dating some of the boys, which began to increase the drama in the group. Street kids have been around for a long time. In 1848, there were more than 30,000 deserted children roaming the streets of London due to families being too poor to support them. By 1922, there were 7 million homeless children in Russia due to the effects of World War I. In the United States, street kids tend to gravitate toward larger cities like New York, San Francisco, and Portland, Oregon. In Portland, like other cities, these youth organize themselves into groups which they call street families. They have 1 or 2 parental figures, a mother and a father, and all others under them are their children. The parental figures call the shots in the group and make decisions for all of their children. They make money by panhandling, stealing, and selling drugs. The families live by a set of rules called the Code. If you violate the Code, you can expect to be punished violently. The Code is immediately drilled into any new member of the street kid culture. Rule number 1 was no snitching. That was first and foremost. The next was to respect old-timers. The people who had been on the street for a long time wouldn't put up with attitude from newbies. Of course, you also weren't supposed to talk to cops, you weren't allowed to talk about where people slept, use their real names, or steal from your brothers or sisters. Of course, these rules would sometimes change depending on the desires of the person upholding them. There are 3 cultures that are present in the street kid lifestyle: punk culture, anarchist politics, and Dungeons & Dragons style fantasy games. Their appearance followed a punk style with mohawks and torn clothes. They obviously had an interest in what they interpreted anarchy to be, not living life in the confines of man's law, which seems contradictory for a group that has so many rules, but that's what happens when a social group is run by children. Then they took on these fantasy identities and acted out elaborate plots throughout the city streets. They carried staffs, swords, and daggers. All of them told fantasy stories about how they had previously killed people or had special training as ninjas or commandos. James Nelson, who went by the street name Thantos, started his own family in 2002, not long before Jessica began working downtown. Across the square, Cassandra Hale, who went by the street name Juliet, was the mother of her own family. In early 2003, the 2 families merged and became known as the Thantos family, with James acting as the father and Cassandra acting as the mother, though the 2 were not in a relationship with each other. That's not how street family parents worked. James was all about violence and had a special title for some of the family members who handled his most violent tasks: Death Knights. Danielle Cox had joined the family in the summer of 2002, and she desperately wanted to become a Death Knight. Though James had a very misogynistic view of what a woman's role should be, he agreed that she could be a Death Knight and gave her the street name Shadowcat. He told her that the final test of becoming a Death Knight was to kill someone. Danielle didn't seem to have a problem with that. Most street kids are in the 16 to 22-year-old range, prime drama years in anyone's life, so that affects a great deal of what happens in the groups, and the drama is not any different. Fighting about who's dating who and who said what about whoever. This type of drama becomes the fuel to find a reason to punish one of the family members. On May 14, 2003, Jessica took the bus downtown and began loudly telling the members of the Thantos family that one of their children, Nicholas Saunters, had offered her money to have sex with him. This was apparently against the code and meant that Nicholas would need to be punished. Nicholas said he only asked for sex, and when she turned him down, that was the end of it. Unfortunately, the street kid culture didn't really care about proof. They had a reason to dish out a beating, and that was good enough for them. When the first beating wasn't satisfying enough, James began spreading a rumor that Nicholas tried to pay to have sex with a 14-year-old girl. Nicholas was punished again, more harshly this time, which seemed to finally appease James and Cassandra. Nicholas got himself to the hospital to be treated for his wounds and then fled the area. Nobody was held accountable for the assault. The attack on Nicholas scared Jessica, and she stayed away from the family for a few days, but once she got bored, she forgot all about the danger. On May 21st, Jessica went downtown to hang out with her quote-unquote friends. The members of the family didn't know that Jessica was handicapped. She hid it well, so when she showed up in clean clothes with brand new shoes smelling of scented shampoo, they began to feel slighted by the young woman. The reality was that she simply didn't understand the nuance of the situation. She spent a few days with the family, sleeping in their squad and helping them panhandle, but behind her back, James and Cassandra were making plans to punish her. Once back at the squad on the evening of May 22nd, Cassandra began questioning Jessica about her claim that Nicholas tried to pay her for sex, suspecting that she had lied. Cassandra then claimed that money was stolen and she accused Jessica. Then, to really set Jessica up as someone deserving of punishment, she announced that she saw Jessica making notes about the family's marijuana sales and called her a snitch. In street life, snitching is one of the worst offenses. Hell, it's rule number 1. Jessica needed to be punished, and ironically, one of the indiscretions that she was being punished for was lying about Nicholas, even though the family made up another lie to justify beating him a second time. It's clear that the street kids are looking for any reason to resort to violence. It has nothing to do with justice. They made Jessica kneel inside a circle drawn in the dirt and took all of her possessions. Then some of the boys began cutting her hair. The next phase was to have all of the girls take turns kicking and punching her. After that, Cassandra proclaimed that Jessica was a human ashtray and the family members all put their cigarettes out on her. Then it turned into a free-for-all, punching, kicking, even whipping her with a belt. After hours of beating, the street parents ordered some of the kids to take her to the steel bridge. 3 death knights were chosen to take Jessica away. One of them was Danielle, who James reminded of her final test. Then Jessica was led north to the east side of the steel bridge, where there was nothing but railroad tracks. Right there, kneeling on the gravel, Jessica was killed. The next morning, as Randy Russ conducted his train along the tracks that followed the Willamette River, he noticed a woman's body lying about 100 feet from the tracks. She was laying on her back and looked to be partially burned. Jessica had been stabbed multiple times, her skull was crushed, and the bottom half of her body had been lit on fire. Within days of the murder, the Thantos family began to implode. One kid was bragging about the murders, other kids were being assaulted, and some were being targeted for death. Crystal Elliott, who went by the street name Spitfire, was one of the kids that was targeted for a beating. Before she could be escorted to the squat to begin her punishment, she called police from a payphone and told them she knew who killed Jessica. Then James put out an order to kill Crystal Grace, who went by the street name Jade, and she too went to the police. This got the ball rolling, and soon members of the Thantos street family were being arrested. In this part of the story, 11 street kids were arrested and convicted of various crimes including theft, assault, and murder. They were sentenced to anywhere from 5 years to 41 years in prison. 2 of them were minors and were sent to juvenile detention. Many of them have since been released and went right back to the streets. The system doesn't seem to be solving the problem, since this is far from the only murder committed by a street family. James Nelson himself had already served time in prison for another murder and had been released less than a year before Jessica's murder. James had spent most of his early teens in juvenile detention in California for sexually assaulting a mentally handicapped girl. When he was released into a group home, he quickly ran away and took a bus to Portland. There, he was taken in by a street family, and at 16 years old, he began going by the street name Highlander. James always seemed to think of himself as some sort of mythical, immortal being. The group he joined was simply called The Family, and might have been the first recorded street family in Portland. This early street family didn't have a static leader. There was no mother or father. They all just referred to each other as brothers and sisters and combined their efforts to survive. They would have a commander who took charge, but that person could change depending on the circumstances. The family's first murder was being planned before James joined the group. Grant Charbonneau didn't have a street name because he wasn't a street kid. He was 20 years old and just hung out with the street kids. Though street kids were dangerous on their own, they themselves were often taken advantage of by older youths in the area. There's always a bigger fish. Grant had told a member of the family, Leon Stanton, whose street name was Fred for some reason, that his father was a disabled veteran and that he would probably inherit his house when he died. Harold Charbonneau, who went by Hal, lived in a modest house in a North Portland suburb. Leon decided to expedite that process by sneaking into Hal's house and stabbing the man while he slept. He stole a coin collection and $5 in cash. An investigation into the murder began, but detectives couldn't find anything identifying a suspect. Soon, Grant moved into the house and brought some friends, including Leon, with him. They never even washed the blood off of the walls in the bedroom where his father was killed. Not long after the murder of Hal, the family determined that Michelle Woodall, who went by the name Misty Largo, was breaking the code and needed to be punished. It was said that she was telling people the real names of family members and that she had snitched on them for a past theft. Most importantly, it seemed that most of the other street kids just didn't like her. This was a good enough victim to satisfy their appetite for violence. On July 26, 1992, James helped the family find Michelle, and she was taken back to Grant's house, where she was tortured and murdered. James wasn't involved in the murder of Michelle, but his help in finding her impressed Grant, so he found James and told him that he was concerned that Leon was going to break down and snitch about murdering Michelle. James needed little convincing and agreed to kill Leon. On July 28th, Leon was taken to the family squat where he was beaten. When the family members were satisfied with their punishment, James was told to kill him, and he did. He stabbed Leon to death, wrapped his body in plastic, and hid it in the bushes. Then he walked around downtown with blood all over his shirt. Nobody said a thing. Ironically, Leon was killed in order to keep him from squealing, but that's exactly what James did, though not to police. He was so proud of his first kill that he told everyone who would listen. He would sometimes claim that he had also killed Michelle, and then started claiming that he had written a hit list and was going to kill anyone who knew about the murders. Not the best thing to say to all the people you happen to be telling about the murders. Soon enough, self-preservation became more important than the code, and several street kids reported the murders to police. They took detectives to the site where Leon had been buried. When James was arrested, he insisted that his name was Highlander and that he was a shadow master, whatever that is. Again, despite the code, James began blaming everyone else for the murder of Leon and even offered to wear a wire, which he did. He went to Grant's house and recorded them talking about Michelle's murder. Once they were all arrested, the dominoes began to fall and the various family members began confessing to all of their crimes. Grant eventually showed police where he had hidden Michelle's body. James confessed to killing Leon, but he said he only did it because he knew Grant would kill him if he didn't. Grant was originally sentenced to death for his involvement in all three murders, but his sentence was commuted to life in prison without the possibility of parole. James, who was only 16 years old at the time, pleaded guilty and was sentenced as an adult to 11 years in prison. People in the area dismissed the murders by a group of violent street kids as a fluke. The media paid little attention to the case, and the local youth shelters shrugged it off as an uncommon scenario amongst the street kids. But it wasn't actually uncommon. In 1998, the next Portland street family, the nihilistic gutter punks, emerged and grew to almost 100 members. Then new families began branching off. The Sick Boys, the 420s, and the Portland drunk punks. These groups are adamant that they're families and not gangs, but they have similar initiation rites. Some need to be jumped in, which means you have to receive a severe beating in order to become a member. Some have to use an excessive amount of drugs, and others are required to commit assaults or robberies. By 1999, the city erupted into what is referred to as the Street Wars, with various families participating in violent conflicts with each other on a regular basis. A member of one street family was accused of giving a fatal dose of heroin to another kid, and all of the families began a long campaign of violence with each other. Violence committed by street families was happening all over the country. In 1999, 7 older homeless men were murdered in Denver, Colorado, and it was initially believed to be a hate crime against the homeless. It turned out that it was members of a street family who were competing with the homeless men for panhandling spots. In Boston, a young woman was sexually assaulted and murdered because the leaders of a street family didn't think their street kids were taking them seriously enough. By the time James Nelson was released from prison at the beginning of 2002, the street war was over and the families seemed to tolerate each other, but they were still filled with violence and drug use. Studies from 1999 showed that homeless youth and street families were responsible for more criminal activity than other homeless youth. 1 out of 4 street family members admitted to crime that qualified as attempted murder, such as attacking another person with a weapon with an intent to kill. Today, there are more street kids in the U.S. than ever before, and their lifestyle is very commonplace among cities throughout the world. There are websites online that help street kids find places to sleep or where to get food in other cities. Many of them can walk into a youth shelter or an internet cafe and connect with street kids from around the world. This has allowed the community to become uniform in their subculture. These street families are only getting bigger and more violent, and the problem doesn't seem to be going away. So when you're traveling on any street, no matter what city you're in, pay attention to which way you turn. because you never know which street might take you directly into the darkness. Thanks for letting us tell you this sinister story. If you enjoyed it, subscribe on whatever platform you're on, and hit like, rate it, or leave a comment. Join us next week where we'll take you somewhere sinister.